Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Barnyards and Backyards Live. I'm Jeff Edwards. I'm an extension educator in the southeast part of the state, along with Jeremiah Vardaman. Good morning, Jeremiah.
Morning.
Glad to have you here. He's an extension educator up in the northern part of the state. Joining us also is Jenny Thompson. You probably won't see her, but you may hear her occasionally. She's helping us run things smoothly, at least better than Jeremiah and I could do on our own. Let's put it that way. And our guest today is Brian Sabady. Hello, Brian.
Hey, gentlemen. I'm Jenny. How are we doing?
Hanging in.
Good. All right.
Brian is an extension educator in the southeast part of Wyoming and Albany County, and he is going to talk to us about edible landscapes today. But before we do that, a couple of things I'd like to remind everybody. Since you are participating on a webinar via Zoom or via Facebook, if you have questions, please use the chat feature and we will pull those questions forward to Brian and ask them as they are appropriate, I guess. If you are watching on Facebook, go ahead and use the comment feature in Facebook and Jenny will pull those questions or post them and we'll bring them to Brian. And anything else? It's a new season. Did I miss something, Jeremiah?
I think we're good.
Okay. All right. Brian.
Okay.
Welcome. I think we're going to turn the floor over to you and good luck.
Okay. Thanks. I'll share my screen here. So I'll get it in PowerPoint. Shows format here and make sure we go to the front. All right, everybody get that? Good. Okay, perfect. We're done. So yeah, I work for the University of Wyoming Extension. I'm based here in Laramie. So some of the conditions I have to deal with, some of you can relate to. Some of you hopefully have a little bit better conditions for your, whether it's a small acreage, a backyard, wherever you might be. But I think kind of a common question, I know Jeff and Jenny and Jeremiah, you all probably get this question a lot, are, what are some things I can grow in my backyard, my landscape, where I can get a little bit of food when I'm already watering a plant that's there. So, today we're going to talk about all the different things that are out there. We will not talk about every last plant, every scenario. There's just not enough time. We really would need half a day, a full day to really get into it more in depth. So we'll kind of go over some different types of plants. We're really heavily focused today on fruit, whether it be shrubs or trees, just because some of those are some of the easiest ones for us to get planted, take care of. Hopefully we aren't having to deal with too many issues as for things stealing our fruit, like wildlife and things like that. But that's what we're talking about for most of today. There's lots of different options that are out there. Obviously with trees or shrubs, you can always plant things in between them, underneath them. So there's lots of different things that are out there that we can use. So with that, we'll kind of get after it here. We'll talk about some different things. If I go to somebody's house or property and they talk about what they'd like to plant, I always try to get a feel for, who they're trying to feed. Are they wanting to plant these edible landscapes because maybe once every 3 years they want to go out and try and harvest some berries or something else from that landscape? Or are they mainly just thinking about wildlife? I've also had people plant stuff and then go, why the heck did I plant that? We'll probably talk about that, Jeff, for one plant species a little bit further down the road here in the slides. We plant it, but do we really like it? How many people are you trying to feed? One of the big things for us, especially here in Wyoming, is time to take care of things. We have to think about, insect and disease issues. We have to think about watering it, probably putting some mulch down. We might even have to think about fertilizer, depending on what our soils are like. So all those sorts of things are really important. If you have limited space, thinking about, is there enough room for it to actually grow as well? So those things are always really important.
So Brian,
lastly,
I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry.
okay.
When you're planning these things out, and if you're starting with a blank slate, would you recommend doing a soil sample analysis to try to understand what's going on, just so you can help those plants along?
Yeah, yep. So yeah, if you have a soil sample that you can take, you can contact your local extension office, then get you set up with one. They won't actually test it, but you help you figure out how to take a sample and send it off. Those are always a really good spot to start, especially if you have a spot where you might have a lot of salt in your soils or different things like that. Maybe it's a really high clay or really sandy site. Those are the things you really want to know before you start planting a bunch of things and then go, gosh darn it, they didn't survive and I'm out a bunch of money. So yep, that's always a really good
Okay.
spot.
All right.
Yeah, and the other aspect of that too, Brian, that you didn't mention, I know you do it, but the extension office can help then also interpret those analysis as you get those back. So
yeah,
get you set up on the right foot, and then talk through what we're going to talk about today through selection option, basically.
right. Yep, for sure. And I think one of the big things too, I always try to stress is, do you have the patience? I don't care who you are, you've always have something that goes wrong with something you planted, right? I've got pictures of some nice Honeycrisp apples in the slideshow, and I had raccoons get into the tree and literally break it like in half. There was hardly anything left of the tree, and then it got diseased and just died. And yeah, so it's one of those things. With all these things, we need to have some patience. So that's really important.
Well,
what's that, Jeff?
Contingency plans as well.
Contingency plans as well. Maybe that's Safeway or Albertsons or something like that. I'm not sure. So
where do we start then, Brian?
Say that again now.
So where do we start with this? That's a good list of things to think about. Now, if I already have an idea of how much fruit I want to produce or how much food I'm wanting to have and what time of year and wanting to take the plunge, where do we start?
Yeah, so we'll kind of get into a list, Jeremiah, of things that are out there. But one of our biggest challenges is making sure that we match the plants to where we live, if that makes sense. So we don't want something that would enjoy a life in southern Texas and plant that in our backyard, right? So if it's an annual, that might be one thing, but what we really have to think about for a lot of our perennial plants is they need to be able to flower, be pollinated, and produce a fruit in a short growing season, right? So one thing that we really like is a new publication that we have out. It's called Wyoming Vegetables and Fruit Growing Guide. So this is on the Barnyards and Backyards website. But on here, we basically have everything under the sun. Starts out with talking about challenges, selecting a site. So if what I'm talking about, what's he keep talking about, site selection, or where are these plants going to do well? We have stuff in there, things about irrigation, timing of planting, all sorts of different things that are out there. So disease issues, insect issues are covered in here. So all these sorts of things will be covered in this guide. So, I'd encourage you to go there, check it out. A lot of what I normally would go over, I will kind of skip because hopefully I'd encourage you to go check this out and see what's available. So, yeah.
That's one of the things about Wyoming. Sorry, Jeremiah. If you're new to Wyoming and you're planning on growing things like you might have in a different place, it might not turn out the way you wanted it to.
Right.
And I think Jenny threw that link there in the chat box for everybody, or if you're on Facebook, it's in the comments section. So you don't have to search too hard to find that guide as well.
No, and if you just go to the Barnyards and Backyards website, it's right there. So, yeah, the other part of that, Jeremiah, is figuring out what your zone would be, where you live. I always tell people to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, depending on the year range that this was recorded, right? So this is our most recent one that I can find. Maybe there's a newer one out there that somebody can point me to later, but So this is really important, thinking about what plants can withstand those lowest temperatures that you receive during the winter. So, so for me here in Laramie, several different times, we've since 2005 have gotten into this 3A, 3B zone. So obviously here it says a 4B, but I'm going to be recommending to folks that they plant zone 3 type plants. So basically, plants that we purchase, they're going to have a zone rating associated with them. Basically, we'll want to go for the lowest zone rating we can. So we obviously would not want to pick a zone 6A apple tree and plant it in Laramie, because then when we get to these colder temperatures, those plants can't withstand those cold temperatures. Water in their cells bursts, and then we have a dead plant next spring. So,
and that's the other thing too. We can have 10 years of really good growing season for all these fruits that we're going to talk about, and then that 11th year, or it could be the 5th year, or whenever, but we get this event in the state
right,
that just wipes them out. So yeah, and that's another contingency plan that you have to be prepared for.
absolutely, absolutely. So the other thing is, I'd really encourage you to do a little homework. It's January. You have some time to think about things, whether it's your backyard, whether you have a property with an existing structure or an existing living snow fence, something like that. But think about what you might have for microclimate. So this is my backyard when I first moved in. There's a fence there. Obviously, it gets lots of sunshine. So here in Laramie, it's nice because it receives lots of extra heat, but things also tend to dry out a little bit faster. So, thinking about these things is important for how much extra water might I need to apply, different things like that. I'll kind of challenge you, when I'm done yakking today, that you can think about what you have on your property and where we can fit things. So with that, we have a very busy slide here, and that's kind of on purpose. We're going to look at it right now, and then we're going to also look at it at the end of the slideshow here. But if we think about our houses, whether it's an urban setting like this one, or maybe it's a rural setting, a small acreage, or maybe even a large acreage, we have lots of different things that are going on. So, here's some different things. We obviously have a part of the property where we might have, some cooler temperatures. There's a lot of shade going on. We might be thinking about, we want some low growing plants here in the front. We don't want to hide the front of the house. We may have some existing trees that we don't want to get rid of, that might be down here. Maybe we have some stuff we need to get rid of. We have to think about slopes, for example, right? So things maybe dry out faster on some slopes, depending on what direction they face. So if we had a slope here, maybe it might not, dry out quite as fast. But it all really just kind of depends. So, if we get, lots of full sun in one area, I think I was misreading or not seeing where north was, but so full sun here, partial shade back here. We can think about putting different plants in those areas. So we'll talk about some of those. So I'd like you to keep in mind some of these north sides of buildings, full sun areas, open areas, partial shade areas, that's maybe under a dead tree or an existing tree. And we're going to talk about those as we go through here.
And so in a nutshell, Brian, as you're thinking of that landscape, if you're new to your property or that, anything that's going to receive full sun, or maybe is up against a structure, like you said, with your privacy fence or your building or garage, right? That tends to be more dry soil.
Right. Yeah. They tend to dry out. And another thing is, I probably am not doing enough justice living in Laramie, but I used to have a house where the way the wind direction was, this would have been the street, and man, that wind just came through, and just, I had an apple tree planted basically here, and then in the back. And that tree just struggled so much more compared to all these other ones, just because it was not protected. And so, really thinking about with some of our more sensitive plants that we're going to talk about, try to find those areas where they're protected a little bit more. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things. It's always a moving target. You have to experiment a little bit, right? I've definitely planted things thinking, oh, this will be a great spot, and 20 or 30 feet this way or that way can make a huge difference. So there's not a set rule for all those things, but something to just think about.
Well, and that's probably a good point too, is if it's not working, don't be afraid to move it, right? Like we can, especially if they're smaller plants, we can relocate them and transplant them and hopefully find a better place where they'd be happier in. So it's not, we always like to say, especially with perennials, like choose their forever home, so to speak, but sometimes that doesn't always work out. And go into Jeff's contingency plan, right?
Well, and then, be an aggressive gardener. If there are things that aren't working, take them out, move them someplace else.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think I know I can speak to that. There's things I'm like, this should work here, and then it's like, no, that was not. No,
what was
it might be good in theory, but this is not. No, this needs to go somewhere else. So this is way warmer. Yeah. So the other thing is, water is really important, especially for a lot of our newer plants. So consistently watering them. Here is a fruit orchard that's been recently planted over at the experiment station at Lingle. These are some plum trees. Irrigation was not set up, but we had to go through and make sure that those plants were watered regularly until the things were set up. So I'd encourage you to think about irrigation. It's in that growing guide we talked about earlier. So go there, think about irrigation that you can set up. If you have issues, connect with your extension office. Conservation districts are really great with that as well. But just think about some ways you can get water to plants. If we don't get enough water, we tend to have issues.
And what I find with this, Brian, is this is one of those commitments that people basically makes you successful or makes you fail at, right? And setting this up to where you either, maybe you're the type of person you enjoy dragging a hose around, right? And don't mind watering each individual plant. There's people that do that and have time to do that. But just set up the irrigation system to make it as easy and simple on you, so thus your plants are getting what they need.
Yep, exactly. There's also some information, out there for fertilizing plants. I'm going to just touch on it real quickly, but that's out there. If you're having issues, things are out there. These are my nice Honeycrisp apples that no longer exist because of the raccoons. So, so this is kind of a short list. This is not all the different types of plants that you can put out there for edible landscapes. These are a lot that work well for Wyoming. There's lots of options, as we've discussed earlier this morning, right? Jeff, Jeremiah, and Jenny, just once we start thinking about it, there's lots of things that are out there. I kind of was looking at this, and it's amazing to me how many of these different species I actually have in my smaller backyard, here in Laramie. If you're trying, you can really get a lot of different things that are out there. So it's one of those things to just think about. We're going to talk here in just a second about varieties that you might pick. So we have, native raspberries, native blueberries that are, native to the state. We even have grapes and hops. But these varieties probably aren't what we want in our backyard, just because they don't have the production like we normally would see with a lot of the more commercial varieties that we find. Sometimes they can be a little bit harder to transplant because we really just can't find these plants in like a nursery. So there's some that we can find in nurseries, but generally what we're going to be talking about today is just varieties that, are commercially available through a nursery or a seed catalog we can find online. So here's my first example. This is a native plum in my buddy's backyard. He's gracious enough to let me take a picture. And then this is a plum at my parents' house. It's going to take about all of these. I should have had a ruler on there. I apologize. But it's basically going to take all of these combined to equal the amount of of flesh that you get off of the one on the right. So sometimes, you know, there's a lot of things as far as thinning and nutrient management there. You know, we could get down a dark hole about all those sorts of topics, but really we're probably trying to find things that produce larger yields, better quality. Not to say native varieties aren't great, and they definitely can sometimes be a lot hardier, so I don't want to discourage that. So if you have a native variety that you have access to, I'd say go for it. But just be aware that, you know, you're probably not going to get as much food off of it. So,
and that partly contributed to our short growing season as well. We could probably put on some bigger fruit and grow better fruit, but we just don't have it in the season. So, but no, plums are an awesome selection. I personally enjoy the plum bushes in my landscape, and I always like in the springtime. They're some of the showiest flowers what's behind me, and they bring in a lot of pollinators, so that's pretty fun and amazing to watch while you're waiting for the fruit later in the year. And I kind of view them as bulletproof. Like if I can grow them, they're pretty hardy. And so you know, plums do pretty well in Wyoming.
okay, maybe we'll come up with a list of, if Jeremiah can grow it, you can too. Is that what?
It'll be a shorter list than what you showed, Brian, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So, you know, I'm not going to cover everything that's on that list that I just showed, but I'm going to highlight some of the larger ones. You know, you look around Wyoming, we have a lot of crabapple trees. We have a lot of apple trees in certain parts of the state that have done well from old homesteads, different things like that. So, you know, if you find the right variety of apple or crabapple, you can have great success. Obviously, they need a little bit of extra water. We just can't go plant them, you know, outside the prairie here at Laramie, where if we get 11 inches of annual precipitation, they're going to die quickly. But if you have some supplemental water, you know, these are great. We're going to just touch on it. We're not going to get really in depth about it, but one of the main things that's important is thinking about a good rootstock. Lots of times we have a rootstock and then the above ground part of a tree. If you're purchasing from a nursery, lots of times they've taken care of this, but we always want to make sure that we find a rootstock that's suitable for Wyoming, and then the above ground as well. So another thing that's out there, you know, as long as something doesn't have a patent on it and you're okay to do it, is you can actually graft a lot of different types of apples onto existing crabapple trees. So
if you have that skill.
If you have that skill. So this
or know somebody who does.
If you know somebody who does, yes. This is my front yard. This is an actual variety of like eating apple that's been grafted onto a crab apple. So, you know, there are those options that can happen. But again, those take time. So, you know, this is 4 years after it's been grafted to where it got large enough to start producing quality sized apples. So, let's see here. There's lots of different varieties out here. This list absolutely does not do justice for the number of varieties that are available. These are just some of the ones that I've had, some of the ones I've liked, different ones I've planted. So this is the ones that, you know, you might see in a nursery here, but I mean, you start looking online, you know, Jeff, Jeremiah, and Jenny, it's like, you know, you've done that, right? And it's like, you know, the one catalog I got the other day, there's like 150 varieties, right? So there's a lot that are out there. The main thing is just thinking about that it's good for a zone 3 area. So
you know, Brian, the other part of that too is the flavor of it, right? So it takes an investment to plant an apple tree and then find out you don't like the apple. so it's a good idea to, if you can, try the different apples in the store that are available, the different varieties. And if you like that particular apple, then look for a way to get that to plant in your landscape.
Absolutely. And I think all of us can go to the store and find a Honeycrisp apple. And I think we'll be hard pressed to find somebody who doesn't like that variety of apple, right? So we have lots that are similar. Zestar is one that I think is really close to it. I have Norkent, obviously here in my backyard, that I really enjoy as well. To me, it's very similar to a Honeycrisp, but there's lots of options that are out there. Just to go back a little bit, again, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but a lot of the trees that you buy on the internet or at a nursery, most often they have a rootstock that's very hardy, but doesn't produce a great apple, right? This would be true with other types of fruit as well. So what happens is they have a rootstock that's hardy, but it doesn't produce a great fruit. So then a graft happens, and then we have a different type of cultivar that's attached to it. So so essentially, you know, we can take a base tree. So here, for example, I've got a crab apple tree. I'm joining a different type of apple to that crab apple. They then join together, creates a graft, and then we end up with what we have here as far as a different variety that's growing on a crab apple. So, you know, this is earlier, this is July, so they obviously haven't matured, but most of these will be about the size of what you would buy in the grocery store when they mature. So,
and doing that grafting, Brian, that's a way of getting, like you're saying, that rootstock that will survive our conditions, maybe the soil conditions, maybe our drier climate, right? But yield us a fruit that we actually enjoy and might be productive enough to fulfill our needs of that. But one concern with grafting is if we lose that branch or the grafted portion, we're back to that rootstock, right? And so selecting is still a big consideration when you do that, but is a great way with trees in particular.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, I should mention too is think about too is that, you know, tree you're grafting into, is it disease free? Can you see my mouse?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, I've got a little bit of fire blight that was already in this tree. So when I graft to it, I know that I'm going to have fire blight issues throughout the rest of these new grafts, right? It's going to travel throughout that tree. I'm going to have those issues. So that's another important thing to think about. Another thing as we're planting in the landscape is thinking about lots of times we need to plant 2 trees for proper pollination. So most urban settings, you know, with like apples, we tend to have enough crab apples and other apple trees around that things are okay. Lots of times they can even, you know, produce on their own without a second tree, but some things like apricots, for example, they need a second pollinator, and we don't tend to have a lot of these just hanging around in all of our settings, right? One challenge with a lot of our fruit is, you know, apples are pretty great. They bloom a little bit later, but things like apricots, pears, they tend to bloom early. So, you know, there's some great varieties that are out there that do well in Wyoming. They're tolerant of our cold. They're actually fairly drought tolerant as well, which is great about apricots. But getting them to actually produce fruit is tough. So here's a good example. These are actually on the north side of a building, of a house. And so they bloom a little bit later in the spring. You can see there's lots of green grass. You know, if we were to look at some of the other trees in the neighborhood, they'd be all the way leafed out. Generally, we don't always see this, right, with our apricots. They're really early. So this is one of those examples of they were on the north side of the house, so it actually delayed when they are going to actually bloom, because that ground stays a little bit, you know, colder. You know, it doesn't warm up quite as fast as if these were on the south side of the house. So thinking about those sorts of things, especially in that landscape design that we talked about earlier, are really important as well. Can't say that enough, that also, you know, just because it works this year, it's not to say the next 3 years we still have really late frosts, or it's like Laramie where we get 6 inches of snow, you know, beginning middle of June, right? So you know, those sorts of things happen. We just have to be patient.
Fruit is not guaranteed in Wyoming.
Exactly. So am I keeping up with questions that are coming in?
You're good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So blueberries, everybody always comes into my office and says, I want to plant blueberries. And I say, yes, me too. But our soil is absolutely wrong for blueberries. So we do have some native blueberries that's pictured here. You're not going to have success with these in your backyard either. They have certain requirements for their soils that we just don't have in most of our backyards, even our acreages. Your best bet is if you own a large chunk of land that's on a very mountainous area and they happen to be their native. Your best bet is to just do these in containers. So we aren't going to get in depth with this, but the thing is, hopefully we have some other ideas to satisfy those blueberry needs that are out there.
Well, and again, those blueberries, even if you did get a native stock and we're lucky, they're going to be pretty small. They're not the blueberries you find in the store.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can see my pinky, but obviously, if you get some the size of your pinky, those are good size for the native ones. So, cherries. Cherries are a great option. Another issue with cherries is sometimes with our really intense sun that we get early spring, we can end up with what's called sun scald. The tissue on a lot of our cherry trees is not real tough. And so we tend to have lots of heating that happens early spring, and then we might go down in like the low 20s at night, right? So Jeff, you might be getting a 55-degree day on Sunday, right? And then what's your low going to be? Mid 20s, maybe? I don't know. Maybe it won't be that low, but that's definitely a possibility that we have lots of times here in Wyoming. And so a lot of our trees, we can tend to have some issues. So thinking about a wrap, some people paint them white. That's something that we can think about. But my point to all this is they can be sensitive, but we have a lot of different options that are out there. Most of our options are going to be the pie cherries, so the ones that aren't super sweet. There are some folks, Jeff, around your area, Goshen County, where some people have had some success. I've talked to a few people with some sweet cherries. But again, it all goes back to, I had 3 people tell me the same thing, Jeff, of they were doing great for 10 years. And then we had a major cold snap and that was the end of that. So that's one of those things.
Things to be aware of.
Yes, exactly. So again, they're very sensitive to some environmental stresses, but fencing out rodents that like to chew on that bark is also really important. These are some of the varieties. You got a bunch of questions for me?
I just had one question for you, Brian. While you have that slide up for all of it, but on that previous slide, you had in there that to space 10 to 15 feet apart between trees for cherries. How do I know that I'm properly spacing these plants apart? Does that usually come from the nursery? Is there a different source that I got to find and look at?
Oh, I would go to that guide at the beginning, and we've got all that stuff in there. So that should be in there. The nursery should help you out as well. So all that stuff, should be in that guide. So, yep, good question.
It's also important to note if they're self-pollinating or need a pollinator, cross-pollinate.
Right.
Need a friend.
So the thing that's great about our tart cherries is they're all self-pollinating. The sweet cherries are not. So they require a second pollinator, and they're really tricky. So you actually have to look up some charts for how they can cross-pollinate. So, but these are some ones that are found kind of throughout Wyoming here. Mount Morenci is very common. Nanking cherry. Sometimes people don't even really realize that it's in a landscape. I've known some folks that, oh, what's this bush with all these berries? Can I eat them? And I said, well, they're actually cherries, right? But here at my office at the fairgrounds, we have a whole fence row of Nanking cherries, and you end up with a lot. So again, they're not very big, which can be a little bit challenging. Some of these get to be a little bit larger, but we do with what we can. So obviously, here's some Nanking cherries. We get a lot of them. You can just have a ton that are on plants, and you can end up with a bowl full really quick. Choke cherries is another option. I grew up in Lander, and choke cherries seem to be always a big thing in the summertime for a lot of folks. So, I know people that made brandy out of it, different types of syrup. So this is one of those native plants that we can actually, go collect some if we want, but also they do great in landscapes. They're pretty low maintenance. They're pretty bulletproof.
They do
So they're
spread.
really great. What's
They,
that?
they do spread.
They do spread, yes. So if you don't like them spreading, you may not want to go with this option. There's also the Canadian red variety that's in a lot of landscapes as an ornamental, but it's basically just a cultivar that somebody found with the dark leaves. And so now it's a big, urban, kind of landscaping ornamental, but you can also collect the berries off of, or the cherries off of that as well. So,
Brian, if we can, we have a question from Anna from Facebook.
okay.
Does Nanking cherry need multiple plants to bear fruit?
It does not. So it's in that tart cherry group. So as long as you have one, you're good to go. So, yep.
Perfect.
And thing is too with the cherries, I really like the blossoms in the spring. That same house I talked about with the tree that didn't do well in the wind prone area. I had a Nanking right next to my driveway, and I beat it up with throwing snow on it and everything else. And the birds would always get to them before I did. But to me, the biggest thing I really liked was a lot of the blossoms in the spring. So, all right, Jeff. Now's where you and I vent about how this is healthy for you, but you and I really don't like them too much. So
it's where we discuss how things are good, but might not necessarily be what we want, right?
Right, exactly. So this is one of those. Think about it before you plant it. They do great. They look great. You get all these berries and you're like, all right, this is cool. This is from a colleague of ours on his farm over by Wheatland. I really don't like these raw. Jeff, you really don't like them raw, but they're really high in antioxidants, supposed to be really good for you, from what I've read. Supposed to be. Some people really like them for jellies, syrups, or juice. I've seen where some people will add a lot of sugar and then put them in like dried fruit mixes. Again, they'll need a little bit of extra water. Same with the cherries. They're going to need some extra water throughout the summer for sure.
We have several of these in our landscape, and they make a nice shrub.
Okay. Right.
They have a really nice blossom in the spring. I'd like to say that the fruit is really nice, but they're very astringent, I guess is the word to use. We've done all of these things with them: jelly, syrups, juice, made wine out of them. It was difficult to get rid of in all instances.
Right. And at some farmers markets, these are very popular. So I'm guessing there's probably some recipes we don't know about, Jeff, but this is one of those options. It's not native, but it is here that we can take advantage of. So,
well, and I have folks in the area who really enjoy them, and they'll come pick gars and use them in their cereal. So I think it's kind of a personal taste type thing. So not to discourage anybody from doing them, but if you know somebody who is growing them, you probably should try them first.
We just got a comment in the chat box from Ann. They are also beautiful in the fall as well.
Yeah, very good point. Yep, absolutely. Yep. They look great. So, okay, currants and gooseberries. Another one of those Jeff's maybe not as high on, but I tend to really like.
I don't have a problem with them.
You don't have a problem? Oh, okay.
Hold on, Brian. Hold on. We
okay.
want to back up to Aronia. We got a quick question from Larson. Do the birds like the Aronia? Do you have a problem with birds in that? Nobody likes them, even the birds.
I didn't notice them at the farm at Wheatland. Jeff, you're shaking your head. No, you haven't had issues either.
It doesn't seem that the birds like them. My dog likes them for whatever reason, but the fruit, I still have fruit on the plants now this time of year. So to me, I would think that if the birds liked them, they would be eating them. They're a very dry berry. So I think that might contribute to the fact that birds and maybe Brian and I don't like them.
We also got a comment from Garrett that their chickens love Aronia.
That's great.
There we go.
Chickens do, not other birds, but
yeah.
So thanks, Brian. Let's move on to currants and gooseberries.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so these are great. We have native varieties, we have non-native varieties. But you can put these just about anywhere. They're fairly bulletproof. You can go partial shade, full sun, providing they get lots of water. But they can be great right up next to a building, right up next to a house, underneath some trees where they get a little bit of sun. So these are great. Currants and gooseberries are always a good option. If you don't like them, just off the bush eating them, for sure, there's lots of great jelly and jam recipes that are out there. So I'm not great at making jellies and jams, but I'm always happy when I get them from other people. So these are some of the non-native cultivars that we see that are out there. Keep in mind that the gooseberries have thorns. I bought this picker. It's actually from Sweden for picking lingonberries. But they're awesome for currants and gooseberries. So especially the gooseberries where they have thorns, but you can get a lot picked in a short amount of time. They work on all the other plants as well, but I really recommend this. So yeah, there's lots of different varieties that are out there. What I have planted in my backyard, one of the black varieties and one or two of the red varieties. I think I have Red Lake and Ben Sarek. So I don't tend to have issues with birds eating mine too much. Again, there may be a little bit astringent, but they do well. And I just like to pick them right off the bush. So here's some of our native ones. Even though these are dark colored, it's called golden currant because of the yellow flowers in the spring. So you might see this along wet areas. But then this is wax, which you'll tend to see in drier areas. And we tend to have a lot of these plants kind of throughout the state. So sometimes with conservation districts, you can get one or both of these varieties when they do their tree sale. So that might be an option if you don't want to go to the local nursery.
And currants are one of those plants that tend to show up in your landscaping because they are distributed by birds easily.
Yes. Yep. So yeah, sometimes even if you don't want them, they show up. So elderberries is another one. Again, another native plant.
This is the one I commented on earlier, Brian.
Okay.
So we can
forget your comment, but go ahead, Jeff.
You can do a lot of things with these berries, but they have a very earthy flavor to them. And so to me, earthy means tastes like dirt, but I'm not a big fan of elderberries.
Right. And this is another one of those, Jeff. I think a lot of folks want it for kind of the medicinal side of it, right? We find elderberries in a lot of different things. So, I always still recommend, try to make sure you get those things cooked. Some people do them raw. My recommendation is get them cooked. You can end up with some potential toxicity issues if you don't. But they are great. They've got great white flowers. I kind of always enjoy them when I see them in the mountains in the spring and early summer when they're flowering. So they're great from that aspect as well. But you do tend to get a lot, when you actually get them established. So that's definitely another great option. Another option that's out there, I'm going to let the expert who wrote the guide on this talk a little bit about this while we've got a few minutes left, but grapes are an option. There is a variety of grapes native to Wyoming, but they're just not great. You don't get much and they're not what you're after, but grapes are an option. I'd like to point you out that Jeremiah's put together the Wyoming Grape Guide. It's on the Barnyards and Backyards homepage. We aren't going to go through that, but there are some options for, fresh eating or wine or jams, things like that. So Jeremiah, do you have any, quick comments you can give to the group on success or not success with grapes?
Yeah, grapes. Yeah, grapes are, there's a lot, but it's very much like Brian said before, it's a lot of planning for grapes, making sure that you have something to grow on. So a trellis system, a fence, some structure to vertically hold them. The big thing that I would caution people with grapes is we do not want to get into grafted grapes. So that's going to be in contradiction to what Brian was saying with apples and the other trees and other types of fruit. The problem with grapes is that union or that graft usually does not survive our winters, and then you got to go back and basically you're growing the rootstock, the one you don't want. The variety that you want to select for Wyoming, there are hybrid varieties. So they are a cold hardy variety is what you want to look for. We don't want the muscadine grapes or European bunch grapes. They just will not live here. And specifically for grapes, if you get into licensed nurseries for grapes, they actually put a temperature, the lowest temperature that they can tolerate for that variety. And I recommend that over using the zone type rating on grapes because they'll actually say this grape does well up to 0 degrees or -30 or -40, whatever it is. And of course, the colder that temperature, the better off you are of them possibly surviving in Wyoming. There are some table grapes that could grow here in Wyoming, have a possibility of growing, but table grapes tend to be a little bit more susceptible than wine grapes. And so the wine grapes tend to do the best, but again, you're looking for that cold hardy variety hybrid, no matter if it's a table grape or a wine grape. And even though it says wine grape, it can be used for the juices, jellies, jams, and you can even eat them fresh if you prefer their distinct flavors. So.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. That's a great overview. So yeah, I'd encourage you to go to that guide because there's a lot of information on there. So it's something that I would encourage you to go for sure. So yeah, thanks, Jeremiah. The other one that's out there is hawthorns. Again, one of those, it's not a very common one, but definitely something wildlife enjoys. There's some varieties that humans, can eat as well and are great. They have nice flowers. The one thing is to think about, they tend to have a lot of sharp thorns as well. So thinking about those things is really important to, if you have kids or you're going to be working around it. I just don't enjoy roses in my landscape for that very fact that they're sharp. So, but I really like these. They're hardy for Wyoming, and it's an option we tend to not think about a lot. Okay, another one that I like, if you are set on blueberries, I would suggest you try this one. Maybe our palates are different from everybody here, but this is one that I really like. Does great in Laramie here. It's really cold hardy. You do need 2 of these plants for pollination. And you tend to get a fair amount. It's going to look just like some of the other ornamental honeysuckles that we have. But these are, cold tolerant, seem to be pretty dang tough. And, to me, I think they're very, very tasty. So, but they go by honeyberries, blue honeysuckle, haskap berries. There's probably some others out there floating around as well. So,
Brian, when is the fruit ready to harvest?
Fairly early. Trying to remember here, Jeff.
July, mid-July,
late July, early August. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So,
hold on, Brian. Got a
go
question
ahead.
on that haskap berries. Do they require acidic soil also, or do they tolerate our soils?
They'll tolerate ours, which is nice. So they can tolerate some acidic soils as well, but for the most part, they're still fairly tolerant of our soils. So you don't have to worry about putting them in containers or other things like that. Yep.
So they have a little bit wider of a tolerance than just the blueberry then.
Right. Yep. Yep, for sure.
Brian, I think we need to put
question.
in the tunnel at Torrington.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm
That's
good.
fair.
All
Yeah.
right. As long as you share with me.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Perfect. Okay, raspberries. This is another one we could probably do an entire show on. But again, aggressive spreader. But if you have an area next to a building that gets a little bit extra water from runoff from a gutter or a roof or something like that, this is something that you can think about. Again, most of the time there's lots of different, red, black, yellow, purple varieties. For most of Wyoming, we're going to probably think about the red varieties. Most often it's easiest just to cut them back each year. You know, I have some varieties here in Laramie that tend to not hold up as well as they do in other parts of the state. So I have both the primo cane where they produce flowers and fruit on the first year cane. I also have the flora cane varieties where they produce a fruit on a cane that, you know, was produced in the first year and then comes back the second year to produce more fruit. I tend to have a little bit more of a struggle with the flora canes here in Laramie in my backyard is what I've noticed than other places. So could be operator error, Jeff, but I know other places that are a little bit nicer climate tend to do a little bit better. So so that's one of those things to think about. Find a good, you know, variety that's cold tolerant. So so they're a great option. One of the things I really think is underutilized that I really encourage people to plant are Saskatoon serviceberries. It's actually a native plant, but we have other cultivars from the East Coast, Canada, that we find commercially. So this is in my backyard. This is that first year that I moved in, obviously. But we tend to get a fair number of berries. I think they're great to eat. One thing you will have to watch is the birds key in on them quite quickly. So as soon as they're this color, they're basically gone. So you might have to think about bird netting, but they start out whitish yellow, turn to red, and then go to purple. But I really like these fresh. You know, I don't even pick them to put them in a bucket usually. It's like I just go out each day and get my hand full and I'm good. So whoever made the comment about fall colors, again, I really like mine in the fall. Some people even just pick them for the fall colors lots of times, not even worried about the fruit. So, but yeah, they also get a nice great white flower. This is the native variety here with its flower, but you'll find lots that are out there, some that are taller, some that are shorter. Sometimes it's hard to know what you have if you move into a place or find an existing one, but they're pretty hardy, which is nice. Mine I have not been kind to at times and still is doing great. So Jeremiah, this might be one you think about.
I love them. Yeah, service berries are awesome. We don't have one in our area, but I do like them.
Yeah. This is another native one that's out there. It's been a fairly big food source for a lot of you know, native people that are native to North America here. And it's been really important, you know, for, you know, birds and wildlife and humans. Again, this one has really big thorns. So this might be something for like a living snow fence along with the plums where you mix it in. That might be a great option, but it's a cousin to the Russian olive, so they look fairly similar. But you know, it provides a really great berry. Not great until it's fully ripe, and most people would probably almost always prefer that it's in a jam, jelly, some other you know, mix that way. So you know, you find the time when they're ripe, when you can eat them raw, that's great. But most of the time you have to really watch, kind of test one at a time until they reach that point. So it's kind of tricky from that aspect.
You need to have a lot of time when you're harvesting them.
A lot of time, yes. Think about that berry picker. So yes.
Now, do those ones spread?
They won't, generally not. There might be some that spread from birds or other things like that, but generally they don't. They don't do a lot of spreading like we'd think with the chokecherry.
Okay, great.
Plums, we've already kind of talked about a little bit, but they're fairly bulletproof. This is a really dry, this is a really wind prone area. This is like my favorite tree in, I guess it'd be in Carbon County actually, but so this is in Medicine Bow, which for anybody who's been there knows it is not where I would expect to plant a lot of trees, right? Without good protection and lots of water. So this is a plum tree that's doing just fine there. Pretty cool. But you can go with the native variety. We see the native ones planted, you know, in living snow fences and other places. The big thing I'm going to just point out, we're not going to spend a lot of time, is really make sure that you select ones that are in the same group. This is outlined in that guide, but they do require cross-pollination and they have to be in the same group. So we have American, we have European plums. They don't intermingle very well. So if they're not in the same group, close together, you're probably not going to get good pollination. Okay, we're going to finish off here on some strawberries and then talk about our landscape thing real quick to stay on time. Strawberries is another option. The native one is obviously here on the right side of the picture, or left side, I don't know how you see it, but the little ones with my finger. And then Fort Laramie varieties on the left. So we do have the native variety. I probably wouldn't recommend planting those, but they do a great job of being kind of a low cover. They're great for wildlife as well. But they're one of those things that I really enjoy, something I look forward to. Again, one of those, right, Jeff and Jeremiah, we could probably spend a whole hour talking about strawberries and the different types and care. One thing I would encourage you to do is just find one that's cold hardy for your area. Think about adding some straw in the winter to kind of protect the plants. Here in Laramie, if I don't protect them, it takes them a while to come back in the spring. They get some winter damage. You need to think about, if it's an older stand, pulling out some of those older plants, getting some newer plants to establish. For me here in Laramie, I tend to have a lot of nutrient issues if I'm not on top of how the leaves look, my nutrient management for fertilizer. So if you're going with strawberries, just know there's more to it. And just simply planting them, I would say, and that guide can outline it. I also outline that you should fence them away from pets and wildlife, because sometimes, right, Jeff, you come home and your dog's in a food coma because she went out and ate all of your ripe strawberries, and then you're just mad. So if you've been a victim of this, which I have been, you may need to think about fencing out the dogs. So,
and you couldn't beat her because she wouldn't have any idea what she did, right?
No, she didn't. Just like, those are the treats you left me, right? So
yeah, I love these things. Thanks, man. You're the best.
So yeah, is there any other questions before we kind of finish off with this?
We have one. It isn't what you've covered, Brian, so I don't know how you want to handle it. But the question is, are there any recommendations for growing starchy plants, potatoes, camas, sunchokes, etc., for an edible landscape?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is, you're probably going to have to set aside some different areas where you can, strictly have it set for those. Some of those other species I'm not as familiar with, but for sure with like the potatoes, finding that good spot where they do have some full sun, paying attention to, disease management, Jeremiah, right, is probably really important as well. So, if you have one of those areas where you don't have anything else growing, it's fairly good soil, you can keep it well watered, that's a good option. So for that, obviously you'd probably think about one of these sunny spots. Maybe it's a little bit protected. That'd be good. So
closer to a kind of a garden setting, what we're wanting there.
Probably, yeah. Maybe you can fit it into like this area here where we'd have ivy. I would suggest, maybe this is kind of more of a garden setting here between a sidewalk and a driveway. You can think about that. One of the ag fraternity here in Laramie, they've got a similar deal right along a sideway, and so they plant corn every year in it. Again, kind of more of a garden type setting, but they have corn that's there. So some of those options might work as well.
Sweet potatoes would work too.
Yes.
Maybe not in Laramie.
If you're warm enough. I don't talk about that here. So
plant early and make sure you have lots of room.
Right. Yeah. So to kind of recap a little bit, if we had a larger area, this would be great for some of our larger trees, the apples, the pears. I think my slideshow skipped over pears. unfortunately, but pears also grow. These are some pears in Wyoming. This is a summer crisp variety. Again, with the apricots, they tend to be in that boat of they bloom super early. So maybe thinking about, those pears, apricots on this north side of the house would be really important. The pear varieties are also included in that guide, so you should be set there. But thinking about some of those, our apple trees that bloom a little bit later, we can put out in some of these sunny spots. Thinking about some of our more bulletproof type plants like the Nanking cherries, maybe they're going to do great along some of these driveways or spots where it's, I don't know on here, but a slope where maybe we have less than ideal conditions perhaps, or along a fence. So there's a fence here, they're probably going to do great. And then incorporating things like the currants and gooseberries. So if we end up with a little bit of shade, maybe kind of interplanting with some of the currants and gooseberries in between some of those taller plants that shade out during different parts of the day. That's important as well. So all those things are really important to think about. But even like the hawthorn, for example, if we have a really exposed area, it's probably going to do great. Where it's full sun, maybe it gets a lot of wind, different things like that. All those things are options. We talked about the grapes, for example, Jeremiah. So maybe you'd want a high and dry area here where it's up against a fence, where it's protected, gets extra heat.
Yep.
All those sorts of things would be ideal for that. So
especially if it was protected there, that fence can provide some protection from the north winds or northwest winds. Yep.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, selecting that right area is really going to matter. And I think the other aspect that I see with this, Brian, I'd like to get your perspective, but at least in my area, the clientele I work with, I even fall victim to it now and then, especially with shrubs and trees. I just tend to not plant them far enough apart to when they reach their full mature size, then they're shading or growing into each other or things like that. And so really being conscious and paying attention to that spacing really matters, especially for those larger perennials, it seems like to me.
Absolutely. Yep. So how are we doing on questions? Do we have any questions we need to answer? Or
Jeff has been handling a couple of questions on sweet potatoes down in the chat box. I think we're all caught up on questions, Brian.
Okay.
Jeff, did I miss anything?
I don't believe so. I think we've got them all, unless there's something on Facebook, but I think Jenny has pushed us all of those, so we're good.
Okay.
Well, good program, Brian.
Thanks. Yeah, if you have other questions, you can contact me. It's one of those things. It's always kind of a moving target for figuring out exactly what you want where. There's new things that come out. So, there's all those options that are available. So yeah, while we're finishing up, I'll just leave this up here in case anybody else wanted to see what we had for varieties of pears. But otherwise, yeah, if we don't have any other questions, I guess we've gone till 11. So whatever else you need from me, I'm available.
Awesome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a great show. Actually, I'm pretty excited. I think I might want to try a few different things this year on my, I have to get home and do some planning and looking, see what I can source. But want to thank everybody for coming and participating. We do it for you guys. This is why we're doing Barnyards Backyards Live. It's one of Jeff and Jenny's favorite programs to put on and enjoy it. So we're really glad that you can join and make the time for us. With that, Jenny, if you have a second, if you would throw up the Barnyards and Backyards website while I'm chatting, if you want to know more. So the Barnyards and Backyards website, Brian highlighted that several times through the show. It is a huge resource. We try and keep just populating that, keep it current. Anything new we throw in there. But on the Barnyards and Backyards website, you're going to find those links that, or those resources that Brian showed, the fruit guide, the grape guide, the fertilizing landscape plants, that's all in here. Also, we have the Barnyards and Backyards Live portion of the website. So get on there if you want to see what's coming up in future programs, the future schedule, but also shows like this one. We're recording them and throwing that back up there. And then Jenny does a fantastic job of putting the actual links to the resources that were mentioned within the page along with the recording. So we kind of make it a one-stop shop for you, make it as simple and easy as possible. The other part is Brian started off with saying contact your local extension office. We have an extension office in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation as well. So reach out to us. If we can get you some physical copies of those publications, help you with soil samples, or just help you with selection, let us know what we can do to help you. The last portion of this is, I believe Jenny probably already threw it in there, but again, we do these shows for you. And so we need an evaluation back from you. We just want your feedback. Jenny has thrown that link into the chat box, but also in the comments box for Facebook Live. If you get a second, it's very short, simple feedback. We just like to hear from you of how many people joined. What did you like about the show? Are there show topics that you recommend for us for future shows? But with that, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you, Brian, again for joining us. Jeff, Jenny, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.